Hi, my name is Jack Rivnak, and I'll be doing a project on the Aztec culture and what they really were. So, I first want to start off on why I chose the Aztecs. It was a culture that I learned about very early on into going through up the education system. I believe I started learning about them in the sixth grade, and they always fascinated me between the culture that they built, the pyramids. As many of us think pyramids, we usually think Egypt. And I think that is what is really interesting is that, from my knowledge, they were one of the first people to actually communicate without using a verbal cue, such as me talking or anything else. So I wanted to go over the basic history as well before we start looking into the culture as a whole. A lot of the people that went through the education system and learned about the Aztecs growing up, we learned that they were mainly filled full of militaristic ideals. They had behaviors that were kind of seen as extreme or brutal to probably today's standards, and they were a very warlike culture, as defined by a lot of different researchers that I've been looking at. Uh, the next thing is that they also had a lot of violence in their culture, but it was more for the religious sacrifice that they had on those pyramids that we saw in the last image. There would be human sacrifices that would go up there, and it would almost be like a little presentation of this ceremonial gathering that they would have. The most common sacrifice was usually towards the sun god, which was also responsible for the war like defenses and those type of aspects. And during the Spanish Inquisition, a lot of the stereotyping that we know about the Aztecs were actually put in because of the Spanish. When they came over to South America and the Latin American areas, and even Mesoamerica, which is where the Aztecs were located, they saw them as very bloodthirsty and savage individuals compared to what we would probably, or they would probably have back in the day, as they were more developed with muskets, rifles, cannons, that type of thing, and they were pretty primitive. They were using spears, shields, and that type of format. So the next thing that is a really big portion to their culture is that it still lives on today. On the left side, we see Tenochtitlan, which is kind of in the northwestern area of the Aztec Empire. But where that stands is actually current day Mexico City. And the Aztec actually influenced the flag for Mexico, which, as you can see on the right, is a eagle with the snake in its mouth. I believe it's a rattlesnake, and the cactus, and down below that is like a little patch of like brownish area, which is actually supposed to resemble a piece of land surrounded by a body of water. This actually accurately represents where Mexico City, or Tenochtitlan, is located. This is what they believed that they saw as they were approaching this area, and saw it as a symbol that they would be able to sustain a life there. The race. So, as I mentioned, that they are Mesoamerican, which is kind of right above where we would consider Latin America today. The population back then mixed with some of their other groups, as there were a couple allies within their group. Was supposed to be apparently between 8 to 9 million, as stated by CATS. Their language that they spoke is actually still present today. It is spoken by over 1 million people scattered through the areas of the Valley of Mexico. Through their language, it seems to be a combination of symbols like hieroglyphs in Egypt. As we can see, that there's is somewhat of a dragon type looking thing that was crocodile. There's things that resembled wind, deer. There's a skull over here for death. Even though that the rabbit, I would also say, is pretty close to a skull like format. And then they also had their own form of writing system in terms of actually writing out words, and that is all able to be seen on the right side of the screen, and it goes through their alphabet and kind of how they formulate their words. The social class and norms that we typically see is a tribal democracy. I have seen other research that has alluded to them being a form of totalitarianism, and pretty much what that is a form of dictatorship. Um, the men and women were both separated and unified throughout their social classes, but most men were typically warriors and haven't seen and served in the military and that type of form, where the women were more commonly seen as midwives, priestess, artists, and other craftspeople that would maybe make their armor or some weaponry and or even just resemble the art or language that they were speaking onto the temples and pyramids. But what's very unique about the Aztecs is that both the men and women were able to hold administrative roles within the society that they built. As we see in the lower right corner, there's a depiction in a pyramid format showing where the lowest part would be the hunter gatherers, and then a lot of those people were often seen as peasants. And then we go to the merchants and artists and that type of thing, where things like priestesses and craftspeople were all held up on a higher end. And then there's the council, where both men and women could exist. And then you obviously had your leader. So gender privilege and sexuality was very minimal when it came to the Aztecs, as there's not a lot of information out there about it. The most common thing that I've been reading was that men were typically warriors and women just weren't. And that's just kind of the gender privilege. To me, I don't know if that's necessarily a privilege, as people die in combat. There's other forms of torture and stuff like that that would exist throughout the wars that they would have. But overall, with that, it's kind of ideally seen, I guess, as a gender privilege back then. But now I think it would be kind of considered maybe not so much of a privilege, but back then it was. The next thing that there's actually very little information about is the sexuality within the Aztec. The majority of the research comes right before the Spanish conquest, but it is not studied that frequently. Um, and there's not a whole lot known about it, as the information is written in the natural language and not. I mean, there's a million some people that can read it, but it's not going to be as of fluent. It's going to have some shows to actually depict what's being said. The minority groups within the Aztec civilization mainly stemmed in the form of prisoners that were captured in war and primitive uh, agriculturalists. And the main reason why prisoners were usually a minority group is that they were taken from another tribe or something of that sort, and they greatly outranked the majority of other small tribes that were around them. A lot of these prisoners were also used for the human sacrifice that we can see on the right side, where they'd either be cut up, beheaded, and their head would roll down the stairs, and so on. The worldview. So there wasn't a lot about necessarily the Aztecs and other cultures within that area, but more of when the Spanish got there during the Spanish Inquisition. As I mentioned before, that they had a lot of interaction, and the Spanish obviously saw them as bloodthirsty savage, whatever it may be. But during this era, there could be a lot of discrimination within the area. I mean, once the Spanish came in and were looking for the gold and trying to expand their area. I mean, it caused issues for the Aztecs and Tenochtitlan. I mean, at one point that they were probably known for being one of the more powerful civilizations in that necessary like general area. So, yeah, the death whistle. Now, not a lot of knowledge is known about the death whistle other than really how it really kind of came to be in terms of the name and what we believe it sounds like. From my knowledge and my research, there's nothing that directly depicts on what it was used for, but there's ideas and concepts around it on pretty much on how it got its name, the death whistle. It was initially found in 1999. It was found in Mexico City, which is also known as Tenochtitlan. And it wasn't until about 15 years later that they kind of found what the use for it was. It's believed to be a form of religious ceremony during the human sacrifices and stuff like that. But it's also believed to be used in war. Um, the sound it makes is this brutally screaming, violent, dying screech that a lot of people weren't like really sure of where it went, but like they just knew that it was something to be afraid of. Now, there not isn't necessarily any research that directly says that it was or wasn't used for war, or if it was or wasn't something to be necessarily afraid of. As I mentioned, that it was used in the religious ceremonies for human sacrifice, stuff like that. On the left, we see a more typical style of death whistle and kind of how that's formatted. The one on the 3D print that I chose is kind of similar. I mean, it's a little bit more of a rounder shape on the inside and stuff like that. But the one on the right is actually the 3D print that I downloaded from Thingiverse, and I printed it out in this bone color. As you can see, both the picture and the skull itself has some texture. And when they went back to research these and try and find more death whistles, it was believed that they were initially used from actual human skulls and animal skulls. They would cut and burn the skull around the enemy's neck, and then take dirt and other land formations and kind of pack it in the skull to help form this whistle, to, for a lack of a better word, and that's pretty much what it is. Um, in terms of sound, I don't believe that this is the best accurate representation of the sound itself. As I mentioned, it's supposed to sound like a person dying or something of that sort. And yeah, I think the more common ones that you see that are like physically handmade or more commonly found within that area are usually made out of things like terracotta, other forms of clay, and that sort. I also know that people have made resin ones, and to me, they still don't sound as good as the terracotta. I think it has something to do with the ringing in it, but this is pretty much what it sounds like. So, yeah, that was my presentation, and thank you guys for watching.